Padre Pio spent decades listening to people pray. He heard thousands of prayers, tens of thousands, prayers for healing, for provision, for protection, for guidance, for miracles. People came to him specifically because they believed his prayers carried unusual power. That proximity to his holiness might make their requests more likely to be heard, more likely to be answered. And they were not wrong about his prayers. Miracles did occur. Healings did happen. Impossible situations did resolve. But Padre Pio noticed something that troubled him deeply. That most of the prayers he heard, despite being sincere, despite being fervent, despite being repeated endlessly, were completely ineffective. Not because God was not listening, but because something blocked the prayer from reaching its destination. He discovered this pattern slowly, over years of observation, of watching people pray the same prayers repeatedly without result, of seeing genuine desperation combined with genuine faith produce nothing, of hearing requests that should have been answered remain unanswered. And he began to understand that the problem was not with God's willingness or power. The problem was with the prayers themselves, or more precisely, with the interior condition of the people praying. Something was blocking transmission, creating interference, preventing the prayer from functioning as it should. The discovery came through a specific encounter. A man who had been praying for his wife's healing for 3 years. Cancer. Progressive. Painful. The man was devout, attended Mass daily, said rosaries constantly, fasted, made pilgrimages, did everything prescribed for obtaining divine favor. His faith seemed unshakable, his persistence admirable, his suffering genuine. Yet his wife continued to decline. No miraculous intervention, no sudden remission, just steady deterioration toward death. And the man could not understand why. He had done everything right, had prayed everything properly, had believed without doubting. Why was God not answering? Padre Pio agreed to pray with him, to add his intercession to the desperate plea for healing. But as they knelt together and the man began to pray, Padre Pio saw something in the spiritual realm that explained everything. The man's prayer was not rising, was not reaching heaven, was instead circling back on itself, creating a closed loop that went nowhere. Not because the words were wrong, not because the faith was insufficient, but because something else was present, something that prevented the prayer from functioning, a blockage, an interference, a sin so fundamental that it nullified everything else. When Padre Pio asked the man about his relationship with his wife's doctors, the truth emerged. The man blamed them, held deep resentment, believed they had misdiagnosed initially, had delayed treatment, had been negligent. The man was stunned. He had not considered that his resentment toward the doctors had anything to do with his wife's healing. They were separate issues in his mind. The doctor's incompetence was one problem. His wife's illness was another. His prayer life was a third. But Padre Pio showed him they were connected, that his unforgiveness poisoned everything, created a spiritual toxicity that blocked grace. Not just grace toward the doctors, but grace toward everyone, including his wife. Because unforgiveness does not stay contained. It spreads, hardens the heart, makes the person incapable of receiving mercy because they are actively practicing its opposite. This pattern, once Padre Pio recognized it, appeared everywhere. People praying for financial provision while harboring resentment toward those more prosperous. People asking for reconciliation in relationships while refusing to forgive past wrongs. People pleading for peace while nurturing grudges. People seeking God's mercy while denying it to others. And in every case, the prayers were ineffective. Not because God was withholding, but because the people praying had created conditions that made receiving impossible. What made this particularly insidious was that most people did not recognize unforgiveness as serious sin. They acknowledged murder, adultery, theft as grave offenses. But holding a grudge seemed minor. Maintaining resentment felt justified. Refusing forgiveness appeared reasonable given the depth of the hurt. They saw unforgiveness not as sin, but as appropriate response to being wronged, as natural, as their right. And so they nurtured it without guilt, protected it without remorse, and wondered why their prayers went unanswered while never connecting the two. Padre Pio realized that unforgiveness is not just another sin on a list. It is the sin that prevents all other spiritual remedy, because everything in the Christian life flows through mercy, through receiving forgiveness and extending it, through being forgiven and forgiving. This is the fundamental movement, the basic pattern. And when that pattern is blocked by unforgiveness, everything stops working. Prayer stops working. Sacraments lose effectiveness. Grace cannot flow, not because God withdraws, but because the person has closed the channel through which grace moves. He compared it to breathing. You cannot hold your breath and complain that you are not getting oxygen. You cannot close your lungs and wonder why suffocation occurs. The problem is not lack of air. Air is abundant. The problem is that you have made receiving it impossible. Unforgiveness works the same way. It closes the spiritual lungs, makes receiving grace impossible. Not because grace is withdrawn, but because you have sealed yourself against it. And then you pray desperate prayers wondering why God does not help, while the entire time you are actively blocking the help you claim to want. The man with the dying wife resisted this at first. His resentment felt righteous. The doctors had failed. Their negligence was real. Why should he forgive incompetence that was killing his wife? Why should he release resentment that seemed entirely justified? But Padre Pio explained that forgiveness is not about whether the wrong was real. Forgiveness assumes the wrong was real. Otherwise, there would be nothing to forgive. The question is whether you will carry the wrong or release it, whether you will nurse the wound or allow it to heal, whether you will chain yourself to the person who hurt you through resentment or set both of you free through forgiveness. More importantly, Padre Pio said, unforgiveness was hurting no one but himself. The doctors were unaware of his resentment, were not affected by his refusal to forgive. But he was affected, profoundly. When the man finally understood this, truly understood it, he wept, not just for his resentment, but for the time wasted, for the months of prayers that went nowhere because he insisted on holding his grudge, for the possibility that his wife's suffering had been prolonged because his unforgiveness blocked grace. He confessed not just the resentment, but the pride that had made releasing it feel like losing, like admitting defeat, like validating incompetence. And Padre Pio helped him see that forgiveness is not defeat. is not validation, is not even primarily about the other person. It is about freeing yourself, about removing the blockage, about making receiving possible again. The man forgave, fully, finally, released the doctors from his judgment, released himself from the resentment, opened the channel that unforgiveness had closed, and his prayers that night were different. Padre Pio could see them rising, moving freely, reaching their destination. Whether they would result in physical healing, he did not know. That remained in God's hands. But the prayers were finally effective, were finally functioning as prayers should, were finally able to receive an answer because the blockage had been removed. This experience changed how Padre Pio counseled people about prayer. When someone complained that their prayers were not working, his first question became not about their faith or their fidelity or their prayer technique. His first question was about forgiveness. Who have you not forgiven? What resentment are you carrying? What grudge are you nursing? Because he knew that no amount of prayer, no matter how fervent or frequent, could overcome the blockage created by unforgiveness. That a soul carrying resentment is a soul sealed against grace. And sealed souls cannot receive what they ask for, no matter how desperately they ask. He would tell people that if they wanted their prayers to work, they had to examine their hearts ruthlessly. Search for any pocket of unforgiveness, any lingering resentment, any grudge they had justified and were therefore blind to. Because these things, however justified they seemed, were the blockage, were the reason prayers bounced back unanswered, were the interference preventing connection with God. And until they were removed, prayer would remain ineffective. Not because God was unwilling to help, but because the person praying had made receiving help impossible. Some people resisted this, insisted their unforgiveness was too justified to release. The wrong done to them was too severe. The person who hurt them was too unrepentant. The injustice was too great. They wanted prayers that worked while keeping their resentments intact, wanted to receive forgiveness from God while withholding it from others, wanted grace to flow to them while they blocked its flow through them, and Padre Pio would tell them plainly that this was impossible, that they could not have it both ways, that they had to choose between their resentment and effective prayer, between their grudge and answered requests, between their unforgiveness and connection with God. He emphasized that this was not arbitrary, not God being difficult or demanding or petty. It was the nature of reality. Spiritual reality works according to patterns. Mercy flows. Forgiveness circulates. Grace moves through people not just to them, and when someone blocks that movement by refusing to forgive, by refusing to extend mercy, by refusing to let grace flow through them to others, they simultaneously block its flow to themselves. Not as punishment, as consequence, as the natural result of closing themselves to the very thing they are asking for. What Padre Pio understood was that prayer is not primarily about words. It is about alignment, about participating in divine mercy, about making yourself a channel through which grace can move. And unforgiveness is misalignment, is blockage, is refusing to be a channel while asking to receive what channels carry. You cannot stop the flow and complain that you are not receiving, cannot dam the stream and wonder why your cup is empty. cannot close yourself to mercy and expect to receive it. The contradiction prevents prayer from functioning. This is why Jesus connected forgiveness and prayer so directly. Why he said that when you stand praying, if you have anything against anyone, forgive. Why he warned that unforgiveness blocks the Father's forgiveness. Why he made forgiveness the condition for effective prayer. Not to be harsh, not to create impossible standards, but to explain how spiritual reality works. That receiving and giving are connected. That you cannot do one without the other. That prayer only works when the heart is open. And unforgiveness closes the heart, seals it, makes openness impossible. Padre Pio said that the saddest prayers he heard were from people who had been praying for years without result, who were faithful in so many ways, who believed firmly, who asked persistently, but who carried one unforgiveness, one grudge, one pocket of resentment they refused. Padre Pio lived long enough to see many people transform their prayer lives through this simple recognition. People who had prayed ineffectively for years began seeing answers within days of releasing unforgiveness. Not because God suddenly started listening. God had been listening all along, but because they finally removed what prevented them from receiving. Opened what they had closed, aligned themselves with the flow of mercy rather than blocking it. And prayer began to work the way prayer is meant to work, not magically, not automatically, but effectively, genuinely, powerfully, because the channel was finally clear, the blockage was removed, and grace could move freely again. What he wanted people to understand was that effectiveness in prayer is not about praying harder or longer or with more faith. It is about removing obstacles, about clearing the channel, about making yourself capable of receiving. And unforgiveness is the primary obstacle, the blockage that stops more prayers than any other, not because God is petty, but because spiritual reality functions through mercy, through forgiveness flowing, through grace circulating. And unforgiveness stops the circulation, creates a closed system where grace cannot move, cannot reach, cannot accomplish what it is meant to accomplish. The day Padre Pio identified unforgiveness as the sin that prevents prayers from being effective, he also identified the path to making prayers work again. Release what you are holding against others. Forgive as you have been forgiven. Extend